to today's education policy seminar. My name is Liz Nigro, and I'm a first year in the dual MPP Ed Policy PhD program. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to ground us in reflection on our country's fractured history. Although we are zooming into this meeting, we each reside on Indigenous land. If you did not get a chance last Monday for Indigenous Peoples Day, I encourage you to take some time after our talk to research your local Indigenous community. Our talk today is a part of the Education Policy Works series and is sponsored by the Bankcard Fund for Political Economy. Each semester, Education Policy Works hosts a number of education policy and research-related talks, led by external and internal speakers, like our honored guest today. These talks are free and open to the public. Our next speaker will be Ruth Lopez Turley on November 8th. For more information on Education Policy Works or the next seminar, please visit our website. Today, we are delighted to welcome Professor Kimberly Robinson, who is the Elizabeth D. and Richard A. Merrill Professor at the University of Virginia Law and recipient of the Stephen S. Goldberg Award for Distinguished Scholarship in Education Law. At UVA, she also serves as a professor within the Education and Baton schools. Robinson's scholarship focuses on K through 12 educational equity, equal opportunity, civil rights, and federalism. Her book, A Federal Right to Education, Fundamental Questions for Our Democracy, published in 2019, investigates why and how the United States should consider recognizing a federal right to education. Today, Robinson will be discussing her paper, Strengthening the Federal Approach to Education Equity During the Pandemic. As a former special education teacher who worked in DCPS last year, I know that I and all of you are eager to discuss her work. As Shannon mentioned, we will reserve extra time at the end for questions, but please note that any additional questions or personalized questions after 1:15 can be addressed via email, as other meetings will begin at that time. Thank you again for attending the Education Policy Seminar today, and I will now pass it over to Professor Kimberly Robinson.
All right, thank you so much for that warm introduction, Liz. And first, I just want to say thank you to Bob Pianta and to Jim Wyckoff for inviting me to do this talk. So when Bob and I talked this summer, I shared with him how much I want to connect more with people at the School of Education, because I see you all as my people, the people who are working on the same things I'm working on. And so I'm really excited to be a part of the School of Education, but also want to just do more connections across grounds. So I'm excited that this is part of that effort, and as well as some other things that Bob and I discussed. So thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to talk about 4 topics today. I know that the paper is a long one, so I'm going to give you a real sense of what was covered in the paper. And then I definitely love to mix it up in Q&A, so we've left lots of time for that. So the 4 topics of the presentation are, first, just how did the pandemic impact students, particularly the adverse impact on students? Second, what was the federal response, the federal relief bills and other federal interventions during the pandemic? Then I give a critique of what the federal response was. And again, I'm just going to highlight some of the key critiques. And then I end with some recommendations for how we could strengthen the federal approach to educational equity. So it's important to understand how the spring 2020 shutdown, when COVID was first came in the news, it really intersected with widespread educational opportunity gaps. So it's important to understand that there were significant disparities in access to resources, access to technology, and access to opportunities to learn, that then the school closures were then placed on top of those inequities. And so with those inequities already pre-existing, the spring 2020 shutdown basically exacerbated what was already there. So there were significant disparities in the opportunity to learn, in the quality of online learning, and opportunities for learning, whether it was online or even some students who returned to in-person learning during the 2020-21 school year. So mostly in the spring of 2020, there were widespread school closures. However, when we returned in the fall of 2020, about 60% of the students still began the year fully online. So these are students who left school around March and just were not able to return in the fall of 2020. However, we saw a significant increase in the number of students who were in school in person by the end of the school year. So over half of public school students were learning in person on a full-time basis by the end of the 2020-2021 school year. 46% went a hybrid format and only 1% remained fully virtual. So there was a big push, particularly at the federal level, to get students back in person. It was clear that the virtual environment was not serving many students well. And so there were a lot of resources focused on making that happen. So what was the impact of this switch to virtual and then to trying to return in 3 different formats? So there were harms caused first by the digital divide. Then I'm going to talk about learning loss, and then I'll talk about inequities and sort of how this affected various subgroups. So when we think about the digital divide, it's important to understand that before the pandemic started, we had really strong data that approximately 15 to 16 million students lack sufficient internet connectivity and adequate device for both. And there's several challenges that cause this. The main 3 are understood to be affordability, availability, and adoption. And so because of these obviously, when intersected with the spring 2020 closures, that then left many students without access to the free public school that they're entitled to attend. That was particularly hard for many subgroups. So I know Liz mentioned that she was a former special education teacher. Special education was definitely one of the hardest hit groups. We had this spring 2020 closure because there are many services that need to be delivered sort of in person to students with special needs. Another group that was particularly hard hit was English learners. They particularly had trouble not only just not always having the access they needed to online technology, but then having someone there to assist them to make sure that any language barriers were being addressed to overcome obstacles to access that they were experiencing. So that's another group that was really hard hit by this switch. Okay, so when we look at the digital divide, it's important to understand that parents were facing a variety of obstacles. Some kids were completing their homework on a cell phone. Some had to, we heard all these news stories about many people having to go to parking lots for schools or libraries to try to connect to Wi-Fi, having to download there and get their homework done. Many students didn't complete their homework during that time. However, even after we've had 3 federal relief bills passed and significant federal funding increase, we still have a digital divide. It has narrowed some. So the good news is the federal relief bills have helped to narrow the digital divide, but has not eliminated the digital divide. And that was particularly important because we saw just over half of the students by the end of last school year were in person full time. So you still have a lot of students that were being hurt by this digital divide. So you see some of the data here about even by spring 2021, 18% of households didn't always have the internet that they needed to be able to access their education. What did this mean? So when you combine the spring 2020 shutdowns and then the 3 models that were happening in schools during the 2020-2021 school year, we had significant setbacks in learning gains for students. What does that look like? So this is just some of the data for what that looks like. So by the end of last school year, you see that the losses for math were about 5 months, according to McKinsey & Company, and 4 months in reading. That's just sort of one study. Renaissance is another group that did some work on this. You always see greater losses in math than you do in reading. So about 4% loss in reading. And notice this is the average. There are much larger losses for subgroups that I'm going to get to, but just know that these are average losses for students. 11% loss in math. And this is also across learning models. So they're looking at students across a variety of learning models. In addition, there's significant, mental health challenges that students are experiencing, and that is hindering the performance of many students. So these learning losses were caused by a number of things. So remember, we have students in 3 models: in person, fully virtual, and then hybrid. This resulted in things such as, less curriculum coverage, a lot more absenteeism, particularly for fully virtual students. Students were less likely to turn in assignments, and there are also grades were certainly falling. In addition, you also saw significantly less teaching and learning time happening in the schools. And so one of the challenges that we see is that different groups are impacted by what's happening with COVID in different ways. So that's true not just for the student groups I've already mentioned, so students with disabilities as well as English learners. That's also true for African American, Hispanic, American Indian, Asian students, LGBTQ students. Each of them were experiencing particular challenges. And so I'm going to talk about just a few of those. There was a higher percentage of African American and Hispanic students who were learning in fully remote environments compared to white students. The data shows that some of that was caused by parent preferences, that African American and Hispanic preferences were somewhat more reluctant to send their children back full time. However, there also were disparities that were caused due to geography, so larger numbers of Hispanic and African American students in large cities, and those large districts tended to have more fully remote environments than other districts. In addition, what you see by the end of the school year is, again, you see this disparate access to in-person learning. So you see 66% of white students were in person fully. However, it's only 41% and 45% for Black and Hispanics, and 57% for American Indian. 27% of Asian were in person. So in the presentation, I'm going to focus particularly on students of color and on low-income students. However, it's important to mention how other student groups were hit. So I've mentioned a little bit about students with disabilities and English learners. It's also important to understand that Asian students who did return to school in person were experiencing an increase in sort of racialized incidents, harassment, and assault. So that significantly increased. In addition, one of the big challenges for LGBTQ students was that many students who have those backgrounds have school as a really safe place for them. Like, school is a very positive place for many of them, not all of them, but it's a safer place than home. And so the loss of that home environment, particularly the social support and structures that occur in home, that's certainly one of the, that was a significant loss for those students. And again, what we see in the data is that you get some mental health challenges that are rising because of that loss. So there's just a lot of things happening across many groups. Easily, there's going to be multiple papers about how each of these groups experienced COVID. And so, one of the challenges with doing a comprehensive paper of this nature is that I can't do any one group justice. So I'm just sort of indicating up front sort of where the focus of the paper is. All right, so here I've tried to give a sense of the various groups and how they're adversely affected. So this is sort of setbacks in math and reading. Again, you see here that the math scores are harmed more. But what you see is different groups are harmed in different ways, and how students are. So students across the board were harmed by COVID, but some experienced a much greater harm than others. It's important to keep that in mind as we think about what we should do about what should happen. So then you enter the federal government, who came to try to aid states and districts and schools in addressing this unprecedented event. And so we had 3 federal relief bills, which you're probably at least familiar with from the news. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, which I'm just going to call the CARES Act because that's way too much of a mouthful. December 2020 Appropriations Act, and then the American Rescue Plan. So to just give you a sense of just the large influx of federal money that happened. The CARES Act, which had basically about $31 billion in federal fund for the pandemic. So that's a large increase. The December Appropriations Act had about $54.3 billion and gave $41.3 4.1 million to governors. So there's sort of two funds that are happening there. There's this like discretionary governor's fund, and then the bulk of it goes into the education stabilization fund, which is the bulk of the federal money. But then you get to the really large bill, the American Rescue Plan. So the American Rescue Plan provided an unprecedented $1.9 trillion into the US and about 122 billion for education. What's important to understand is that if you take the total of those three bills together, this is on average about $3,750 per student. And it's important to understand that because I think there's this impression that there's a large amount of federal money going into the schools. That's absolutely correct. However, when you break it down to the student level, you get to slightly less than $4,000. Now, when you aggregate that at the class and school level, that's still a significant amount, but it's important to understand how it breaks down to the student level. In addition, there was money set aside for students with disabilities and homeless students, as well as for private schools. So what's true about these bills? First, broad discretion in how the money is spent, except for a couple things I have on the slide now about children with disabilities and homeless children. Basically, lots of discretion for the states and how they're going to spend the money. Each of the bills also had a maintenance of effort provision, which said, if you take this federal money, you have to maintain your funding effort. So it's maintenance of funding or fiscal effort that has to be happening. And the other thing they all had in common is that the money was sent through the Title I authorization. So Title I, as you all undoubtedly know, provides money for low-income school children. And it's the large federal relief bill. And there are formulas, very complicated formulas, that you have to send the money through to get the money to districts. This money was sent through those formulas, the bulk of it, not 100%, but the bulk of it. All right, so I've already mentioned state maintenance of efforts. You have to maintain funding effort. In addition, the American Rescue Plan also had something called maintenance of equity. So what is that? That sounds like, hey, they're doing some really good things for equity. We'll slow down and see if that's really true. So on the one hand, they're trying to say, look, we want you to maintain equity and we don't need to repeat what we did with the Great Recession, right? The Great Recession, we gave you a bunch of federal money and a few years later you came and sort of slashing funding, particularly to low-income districts. And so what they said is, we're not going to allow that this year. We're going to say you have to, when you look at FY 2020 and 2023 funding, you can't cut state funds to the top half of high need districts, and you can't cut the top 20% of the highest poverty districts. And so the basic idea is don't try to take all this federal money and then go cut funding to communities of poverty. That's the basic idea. And so they tried to, keep this provision to prevent that. In addition, the other good things that are happening in the bill is that you get some input at the state level into the plans. So that's required. In addition, there's quite a bit of money provided for reducing the digital divide. So much of the money is discretionary, but there's significant funds as well for the digital divide. And the American Rescue Plan also requires that districts have to use 20% of their funds for evidence-based interventions to address learning loss. So you remember those prior slides where I had students were, not doing as well as they would have been doing in prior years. 20% of districts' funds has to go toward evidence-based interventions to address those types of challenges. So what are some of the concerns about this money? This all sounds great, right? We've got almost $4,000 per child. We're getting all this federal money. They said you have to maintain funding effort and equity. So what's the concern? The concern is that there's not enough prioritization on those student groups that I identified. In other words, the students that are being hardest hit, there's not really a federal requirement that we focus on those students, except for the things that I mentioned, such as the 20% that districts have to put toward evidence-based interventions. But that's 20% of a really large number. And so you see that districts then and states have discretion on where else the money goes. So not enough of prioritization on the students who are hardest hit, and it's clear that they were not all hit equally. And the Title I formula is well known to be a flawed funding formula. So there's a robust body of scholarship that says, hey, the Title I formula does not provide enough of a focus on students in poverty. And so, for example, it doesn't drive enough money based on concentrated poverty, right? So if you think about students in poverty, if you have a district that is 40% in poverty versus 90% in poverty, those districts have very different needs. And the funding formula does not take account of that. And so that's just one of many flaws. It also distributes funding based on state per pupil expenditures. And so states with high funding get more Title I funding, states with less funding get less Title I funding. However, what you might think like, shouldn't we be giving poorer states a bit more money because they're the ones where the kids are having a low funding level across the board? But it's not how the sausage was made in Congress, right, to get to the bill. Another concern with the maintenance of equity bill requirement is that you only have to maintain it for 2 years. And we are going to be dealing with the impacts of COVID for many years to come. So the idea that you just have to keep an eye on equity, funding equity for a couple of years, and then there are no more requirements for this large check we wrote is going to allow for future funding cuts to take place. In addition, past maintenance of effort requirements, the federal government has had maintenance of effort requirements before. They're generally not enforced, and the states know this. And so the challenge is that even though we say you have to have maintain your fiscal effort, states know that in this kind of crisis, if you weren't, willing to take back the money in times of plenty, the chances of the federal government coming in and taking back the money during a crisis is extremely unlikely. There are other concerns about the district maintenance of equity concern that I highlight in the paper. First, there's quite a few students that are left out of the calculus. So if you look at the exceptions that are created in the bill, this is about 15% of students aren't covered by the district maintenance of equity, and it's about 70% of districts. So a large number of districts, about 15% of US students. In addition, it doesn't really have a really strong definition of what equity is. It says maintain equity, but you have to understand that that presumes equity existed. And there isn't a strong definition of equity in place. They're merely looking at districts and their poverty level. So that's one of the big concerns. All right, so one of the other concerns is that even if the federal level, you get a lot of discretion, we could say, well, we can trust the states to promote equity. Not really. The data really shows that the reason we have opportunity gaps is that states are not prioritizing the needs of students that have the greatest need and that need additional resources to compete on a level playing field with their peers. So, for example, one of the key challenges that's happening is that districts often implement one-size-fits-all approaches to implement a sort of reform. However, that doesn't ensure that the students who are hit hardest are getting all that they need. A district-wide program can often have benefits for some students and really not serve the needs of others. And so because of that, we're just not driving a large amount of federal aid into the schools in the way that would help them the most. All right, so we've looked at Congress and what they've done. Let's talk about the executive branch. We've had the Center for Disease Control, the White House, and the Department of Education. They've all taken actions that have been really a mixed bag. They've all done some things that are really helpful, and they've all done some things that are really harmful. And this is under both administrations, the Trump and the Biden administration. The challenge is, one of the biggest things they've done consistently across the executive is to send a bunch of mixed messages. We're going to push for reopening. Okay, we're not going to push for reopening. You must reopen, or we're going to take your federal money. Wait, we don't have authority to do that, right? So these mixed messages are happening. And the reason that matters is that communities, disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, communities of color, don't have the resources to be sort of digesting all of this data and new information themselves. They're really more dependent on the federal government to provide leadership. And so because they lack the resources to forge a path forward without the federal support, they're the ones that are hardest hit when you give a mixed message of we're going forward, we're going backwards, right? So they need the guidance and assistance the most. So one of the things that happened is, for example, when the spring 2020 shutdown happened, the CDC really lagged behind schools actually closing, right? The guidance that they gave said, hey, COVID's out there. Like, we should be aware of this, and there are some things that might happen, and you might have to eventually shut down. Meanwhile, like, governors and states were sort of shutting down across the country, right? And it wasn't clear, they didn't give real clear indications of when should you shut down, when should you not. The other thing that happened, and some of this might have flown under the radar, but in summer 2020, the CDC, it made the headlines, said that, look, there's not a lot of virus transmission with kids, and it's not really spread much by children. They then pulled back that guidance and didn't even issue an official statement in the fall 2020 that they had put that out. So it's clear that there was some politicization of what the CDC was doing in terms of what it was communicating about the risk of COVID to children. So it was not only confusing, but it lacked sound scientific support and seemed to be really pushed by the Trump administration. In fact, there was a government accountability study of what the CDC did in 2020, and they found basically, look, the CDC acted in a way that was completely inconsistent, and that was pushing for reopening schools in ways that were not aligned with risk-centered decision-making at the state and local level. That's clearly what should have been happening. And instead it was a reopen. Kids really don't spread it that much and they're not going to be harmed. And that was just inaccurate and not based in science. The other big challenge is that educators repeatedly noted that, look, their needs are not being considered in what the CDC is doing. There was very much a student-centered focus in what the CDC was doing. And educators voiced repeatedly that, look, our needs are not ones that are being focused on in what's happening. In addition, when you look at what what happened in the CDC under the Biden administration, there was significant criticism, for example, when they came out in guidance in February 2020, that the justification for students being 6 feet apart was not really made. And then what happened? The CDC switched again and said, oh, 3 feet apart should be fine. So there's vacillation that's happening. Meanwhile, you have districts and schools like trying to get back up. How can we make 6 feet work? And then they suddenly switch and say, oh, now we can change to 3 feet. Well, that's a game changer, as you guys still know, for schools. 6 feet versus 3 feet is a completely different educational approach. And so the vacillation is something that's really hindering districts and schools. And it's particularly hindering low-income communities and communities of color that tend to have more overcrowded schools with poor ventilation. They're the ones that are being really harder hit by this. So you see the Department of Education, just like the CDC, has been a help, and it's also been a hindrance. So they definitely did some things that were very helpful. Spring 2020, no way that you're going to get all that testing done to report all the testing that's required for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. So those were waived by the US and DOE. DOE also has done guidance, both under the Trump and the Biden administration, have provided guidance to districts. However, one of the challenges has been that there was quite a strain between educators and DOE when the pandemic hit because of the work that Secretary Betsy DeVos had done. And so because of that, many were not willing to rely upon or reach out to the department because of the strain that had been created between US DOE and educators. Another challenge is that the DOE was really quite slow in sort of issuing things. So for example, in May 2020, they said, oh, you need to be serving the needs of your English learners. Well, May 2020, schools had already been shut for a couple of months, and these students were being shut out of getting their needs met. And so the concern has been that DOE really far too often is acting very slowly. Similar to in January 2021, they issued some digital learning guides saying, here's how you can engage in best practices from the digital, with online learning. But again, that's long after we've been online for quite some time. And so there's quite a bit of criticism of DOE in that regard. And then the White House also was sending mixed messages, again, under both administrations. So you probably all heard about how Trump was threatening to take back federal aid if schools didn't reopen. He does not actually have the authority to do that, but he was sending mixed signals with those kinds of threats about what needed to happen. And then the other thing that's more important though than those types of threats is that, when this began, the Trump administration did not say, look, we have to prioritize the needs of those who are hardest hit by this pandemic. Instead, there was a lot of silence around that. And so the concern is that as states develop plans, particularly not just in spring 2020, but in the 2020-21 school year, equity was not something that was a priority of the administration. And so there was no one at the federal level using the bully pulpit to say, we must help those who have been hardest hit. Similarly, President Biden, when he came into office, he actually has been prioritizing equity far more than the Trump administration did. However, he did send some mixed signals as well about when schools should and should not open. So that's been a big criticism as well. And then finally, I'll just end with sort of what should we do about all this? So there's a lot of ways to sort of begin to address the fact that the federal aid has not focused enough on equity. First, the federal government, because of this large infusion of federal funds, has a real lever to insist on educational equity. And the question is, what's the way to do that? One of the things that I say that it really needs to do is we need to reimagine, restructure this relationship between the federal and state government, right? So what you saw with this bill is that the federal government gave out a lot of money and asked for very little in return. Prior challenges with the federal state relationship, for example, No Child Left Behind, they asked for a lot and gave very little. It's like we need some kind of balance between those two, where you have much more of a collaborative partnership between the federal, state, and government, and not sort of either extremes of the federalism option, right? Where it's either I'm handing you a blank check, good luck, let's hear what you do later, or no, you're going to do all of these prescriptive things that we say, and by the way, you're going to write the check for it too. So I'm arguing for just a restructuring of that relationship. In addition, so there's in the paper, I talk about a number of things that you could do for future conditions on federal aid that prioritize equity, including not relying solely on the Title I formula, but having a real focus on driving funding to the districts with the greatest need and greatest concentrations of poverty. But in addition, now that that money has gone out, we have to have the U.S. Department of Education actually enforcing laws such as Title VI and Title IX of the Education Amendments Act, which focuses on gender discrimination, as well as laws that protect students with disabilities, to ensure that the money is spent in ways that is not only just intentionally discriminatory against those students, but does not have a disparate impact. So today, it's much harder to show that districts are intentionally discriminating against particular students. However, much of what they do can have a harmful and illegal disparate impact on those students, and those actions are actionable. In addition, the maintenance of effort and equity requirements should be enforced. And because there hasn't been a lot of past enforcement of this kind of thing, these kinds of provisions, you really need to give notice that you're going to enforce these provisions this time and not just sort of write the check and not expect anything in return. And then finally, the other thing, because the maintenance of equity and effort provisions only focus on 2 years, because of that, we have to really insist that the federal government is going to be a partner, a collaborative partner to states and districts for the long haul. We cannot let the funding cuts of the Great Recession repeat themselves again, because some states haven't even returned to the funding level that they were at before the Great Recession. So now if we allow further funding cuts to happen, they will even further exacerbate what was already a really difficult situation. So those are just some of the recommendations in the paper. There's lots more that we can talk about in Q&A, but I wanted to that's an overview of the paper. So I'm going to
Thank you.
stop screen share.
Wonderful. Everybody feel free to join in. I know it's harder on Zoom necessarily, but to thank Professor Kimberly Robinson for sharing her work so far. We really appreciate it. And also for saving us such a great time, a good chunk of time to dive in and be interactive and engaging here. So the way that we'll handle Q&A is for our attendees, go ahead and use the raised hand feature in Zoom, and I'll go ahead and call on you in order, and then you can unmute yourself and dive in and ask questions. And we'll give you a quick second before I call on the next person in case you need to clarify in addition to the question that you just asked. So feel free to dive in and ask anything you might want to ask by using the raised hand feature. Yes, Allison, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for this talk. My name's Allison. I just joined the faculty here like 2 months ago. So thanks so much for your talk. Looking forward to talking to you later. I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit more information about the maintenance of equity provision. I'm not super familiar with it. And as you mentioned, it seems like there's this presumption that there is an equity to maintain. And so I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about what the federal government is going to be looking at when it thinks about whether, I mean, if they're going to be looking at it and what they really have in mind. Is it like a status quo maintenance with the level of inequity or equity that there is in a place? Can you just tell us a little more? I'm curious.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. So, you know, there's two maintenance of equity provisions. So it's important to understand they're slightly different. So one is at the state level. There's a state maintenance of equity, and there's a district maintenance of equity. The basic idea, without going like drilling deep down to the weeds, is that Congress does seem to presume that there already is equity, and that they're merely, both provisions are aiming to prevent cuts to high poverty districts or schools. And so the maintenance, the equity that you're maintaining is don't institute funding cuts that are going to harm the highest poverty districts or the highest poverty schools. And it varies a little bit in how that's calculated, but the basic idea is don't cut to the poorest places. The challenge is, of course, as you indicated, and as I said in the talk, that presumes that we had equity before the American Rescue Plan was adopted. So the maintenance of equity provisions, important to understand, are only in the American Rescue Plan. So they only apply to that portion of the funding. And they seem to presume that this is equity and just don't do any further harm. The problem is, if states that do have equitable funding systems were planning to shift additional money to help those who are in greatest need, like if that happens in a way that would harm, that would have any kind of impact different from sort of holding the status quo, there's sort of have federal limits on doing that. And so the problem is you could really end up sort of having a perverse incentive of, well, we were going to change some things in how we were going to respond to COVID, but now we can't because of this maintenance of equity provision. So really, it really could have been done in a way that would say, first, are you at equity? And then at least maintain it or don't worsen it, right? But unfortunately, what they did is they said, just don't make it worse than the prior years. Partly because I think they modeled it off of maintenance of effort. So maintenance of effort said, just don't reduce your funding, right? Here it's saying, don't hurt these low-income districts or schools. And so at least when I read it, that's what it reads like. It reads like it just sort of copied that and said, well, we don't just want them to keep trying. We want them to not hurt equity like we got in the Great Recession. And so the challenge is they just don't have a robust definition of equity, funding equity. And so because of that, you just are sort of like keeping the status quo. It's only for 2 years. So, after that, districts and states that are actually complying with it are not going to feel compelled to do anything about how they keep funding. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Great. And Allison, no follow-up questions before we hop over to Walter?
Mine is a Mine is a follow-up question, so
Oh, great.
that works out pretty well. Yeah. Professor Robinson, thank you so much. So related to, I think this is, you mentioned something that I wanted a little clarification on. It was also related to maintenance of equity. And I thought I heard you say something to the effect of like, this doesn't apply to 70% of schools in the country, or 50, which account for 50% of students. And I first wanted to check to make sure I was hearing that right. Okay. It sounds like I
Yeah,
might not be.
the stat is 70% of districts, and it's
Okay.
15% of students, I believe is the stat. Again.
15.
Yeah.
Okay.
15. 50 is a very different number.
Yes.
It's 70% of districts, but it's 15% of students are covered by.
And
that's only the district one. That's only the district maintenance of equity. That's not the state one.
Got it. And the reason for that is that it looked like it was something to do with district size. So it's like very small districts are sort of not included in this. Yes.
Okay. There's a number of exceptions, and the DOE actually aggregated them themselves and admitted like who was, it was actually very helpful as a researcher, because otherwise I would have been trying to aggregate. They said, look, this, we acknowledge that X number of students in districts are not covered. So, I mean, I'm assuming they did the calculation right. I rely on it. But yes, it's not 50%. That would actually be far worse, because then it's like half the country isn't covered by. Yeah. So thank you for clarifying that if that was not clear.
Thank you for clarifying it. But I mean, it still seems like, I assume these are many rural districts that probably, these are still issues there, but they seem they're exempted for one reason or another from this. So I did want to make sure that I had heard that part right, at least.
Yeah, so it's definitely going to be smaller districts that for whom this district maintenance of equity provision, that they're exempted. That's absolutely right.
Great, thank you very much.
Sure.
Other questions?
I think I see Vivian Wong has had her hand up for a while.
Hi, thank you so much for a really engaging talk. My question was how, given sort of the polarization in terms of how sort of the general public is thinking about sort of, the funding of and administration of schools and school districts, especially in the recent year, I was wondering if you have had thoughts about how to sort of promote, I guess, an effort to introduce more federalism into the system as opposed to sort of more local types of district control.
So can you say the first part a little bit, like explain the first part? You're saying given the polarization, do you mean like politically the polarization?
Yeah, so I think that there has, at least my read of sort of the discourse around public education over the last several years, or over the last year, or at least in terms of even the conversations that I have had with just neighbors who normally are not that interested in education policy, but have taken an interest recently in terms of talking about, what does critical race theory mean in schools, and who has control over schools and who has control over discourse of schools. So I was curious how that kind of political conversation in the public sphere, how does that sort of influence or potentially affect in terms of how you think about initiatives that introduce sort of more types of federal efforts across the country, as opposed to, when half the country seems to be at least moving into a different direction?
Yeah, I love this question because I get this question a lot, actually. And I particularly got this question a lot under the Trump administration. They're like, what? We can't possibly want the federal government to do anything near schools, right? And I'm like, no, you're thinking about this too narrowly. So here's the situation. The federal government is actually quite good at doing things when it chooses to, and can do some things well in education. It doesn't always choose to. I'm not saying it's going to choose to always, but it has a capacity to support particularly equity, and in a superior track record on equity when compared to the states. Now, unfortunately, the state track record is fairly dismal. So you might think, well, that's not really saying that much. But considering when you're trying to decide who's going to take the lead on equity, really states have a inferior track record on equity, and particularly on equity in opportunities to learn, equity in funding. There's significantly, sort of evidence that states are not driving additional funding to communities that need it most, particularly low-income communities. So the data is really clear that more than half of the states give either equal funding or less funding to children in high poverty districts. So that's like flies directly in the face of the research that says children in concentrated poverty need more funding, right? And so what's important to understand is that this is meant to be a collaborative partnership over the long haul. It's not really meant to ebb and flow with administrations. The idea is that if you can acknowledge that the federal government is really good at some things, particularly supporting districts, not just with financial assistance, which they did this time, but also with guidance on what works, as well as technical assistance on, sort of how to implement practices that are effective, as well as research about what's effective. The federal government has a superior capacity to do that because of how it can leverage funding to invest in those kinds of things. And when it identifies best practices or supports that can help as interventions, it has a platform to disseminate those in a way that an individual district or school or even a state that is finding something that's really working well for it doesn't have that same platform. And so the collaboration that I see is really in building upon the strengths of the federal government and the strengths of the states. So the strengths of the states are innovation, experimentation, accountability. Those are things that the states are actually better on. But equity is not among those. And so the idea is to bring the partnership together in ways that would have the feds do what they're really good at and the states do what they're really good at. So this is what my book project is. I'm actually just finishing up this month, a book proposal that I'm submitting. And the focus is on just a better partnership between the federal government and the states that builds on the strengths of each level of government. And so this is in no way is this sort of a federal takeover of schools. In no way is this federal control in place of local control. It's simply saying the federal government is better at some things. Even under more conservative administrations, they still have a significant role in protecting civil rights and in sort of addressing other inequities that they may not do it in the way that many would like at that time, but there's still some fundamental things that are involved in equity that they keep doing over time. And I can say that as someone who I spent time under both a Democratic and a Republican administration working on civil rights. And there are just some things that are in common across parties. And then there are areas where they diverge. So it's just building on those strengths for the federal government. And while the states still do what they are best suited to do.
Great. Thank you for that answer.
Yeah,
Maybe
I think
does
that was a great
answer-
question.
Wonderful. All right, Jim, you're up.
So, Professor Robinson, you may want to just pass on my question because it relates to Vivian and your answer touches on it, but I guess I want to push a little bit more on that issue, that your response you just gave to Vivian. I mean, I think that sounds nice. And certainly, I can also think of instances where the federal government has stood up for equity with respect in a few cases that had some meaningful effects. We can think of children with special needs and the federal legislation that brought about, state compliance with, less restrictive classrooms, funding for kids with special needs, and so on. But I guess I'm still skeptical because we've seen so many instances on the other side of this debate. And, even despite what is a huge amount of money that the federal government has put into this over 2 years, it's, I think, less than 10% of what gets spent on education. So it's a huge amount of money, but it's not trivial, but it is small in comparison to what states already spend. And so I guess and we've seen at least one state, I think, maybe more, who said, you know what, I don't want your federal money because it comes with too many strings attached. And so that's the leverage that the federal government has. Okay, if you're gonna take our money, you have to comply with our restrictions. That was sort of the NCLB approach to this, right?
Yeah.
Which, as you said, was perhaps overburdened with requirements. But I guess if we had just been at this for a couple of years, I guess I'd be more optimistic about this. But we've been at this since what, the war on poverty, or go back however far you want, where there have been these attempts by various administrations to work with states, to impose on states. So I guess I'm a little skeptical that somehow, especially in light of Vivian's point about the recent sort of implosion of cooperation across party lines, that we stand much of a chance for realizing the vision that you described.
Yeah, no, that skepticism is totally fair. I mean, I think we are living in quite a polarized time. And so certainly, I can tell you, and I sort of lay out this theory of federalism in other work, like I don't fully explicate it here. So just know that that's, if you're interested in reading more about that, it's in this book that I'm working on, but it's also in my Disrupting Education Federalism paper. So that is the title of the work where I really put this proposal forward. And, I think part of the challenge, Jim, is that the way that the federal government has sought to intervene in education has really been this kind of anemic version of the federal role. In other words, because in 1965, when you passed the ESEA, you had to have such a collaboration across party lines to get it through, right? Because there wasn't no significant role because school desegregation was already happening, but there was less of a significant role in education before ESEA. And so because of that, the legislation was such a compromise that it really kind of watered down what the federal government could do, in the sense that you had to have, Title I follow the child no matter where the child would go, so that it would make sure it would also went to private schools as well as public schools. There was the Title I formula is like everybody gets a piece of the pie, even if you don't have that many children in poverty, everybody gets a piece of the pie so that you'll vote for it, right? And so part of the challenge has been that in the interest of keeping the federal role circumscribed, we have embraced this very anemic version of federalism where the federal government sort of doesn't have really significant influence in sort of what the federal government's going to do, with the exception, I would say, of No Child Left Behind, which asked for a lot and gave very little. And so the role that I'm suggesting is not just asking for significant things under equity, but increasing funding, research, and technical support to get it done. So it is not sort of tinkering at the margins of our current federal role. It's expanding that federal assistance and research and technical assistance to have more of a shared partnership over education. So I can't get there to that model of federalism that I'm proposing under that 10% investment that's happening. I don't stick to that limit. And I'm sure that this big federal increase that we just had actually takes us significantly over 10%, but we didn't take advantage of that to actually ask for things that were focused on equity. And so the challenge is, because we've tried to keep the federal government at the margins, we limit how much you can invest in education and we limit what the federal government can do. And I think that you could have a more, people would be much more open, I think, to a federal role that actually is making a difference, in part because, notice now everyone expected the federal government to come and rescue the states and districts, right? No one thought the feds were going to just sit by and let them all just flounder without the money to get this done, right? But what that didn't come with was an expectation of what the feds will require because of that. It just came with like, please write us the check and then leave us alone. I mean, that's the environment we're in right now. And I think part of the challenge with that is that it doesn't leverage that federal infusion in ways that can help those who need it most. The states are not laboratories of democracy for many marginalized communities. And so we have to take that federal emphasis on civil rights and our, superior but blemished track record at the federal level of investing in communities that can't defend themselves as well at the state legislature level because their education is impaired, right? The people that prevail at the state legislature are not the communities that don't get a good education because they don't have the education to leverage the state legislature. Their only hope really is the federal government. And so part of the reason it has to be a federal role focused on equity is because the people that prevail at the state level are not the ones that are harmed by education because they don't have the tools to get their way in the state legislature. So that's why there has to be a federal investment of that. Can we get there in this political moment? I think we have some room to acknowledge that without the federal government, our schools will be far worse off. And so I think we can leverage that moment into say, okay, what's that partnership look like in this new day when we realized that we needed the federal government to help us get out of this? Are there things that we can make at a federal sort of national commitment in moving forward on these issues? So no, I don't think we're there today politically, but I think that we have to acknowledge that our current federalism approach is not getting us where we need to be as a country. At least it's not supporting the education we need for democracy. It's not supporting the education we need for the economy. It's not supporting it for a whole bunch of other ways that I could keep going on about. So I may not have convinced you, but hopefully at least I've responded to the question. Yeah.
Before we dive over to Liz, just wanted to give Jim a moment in case he had any follow-up remarks. Okay. Liz, your turn. Oh, you've taken your hand down. Maybe.
Oh, no.
Oh, no, she still has a question.
Great.
Thanks, Professor Robinson, again for your talk. And I think that it was a good segue, the point that you just described about having a laboratory for democracy, into my question, which is, do you think the federal government within these new partnerships have a role to play in shifting public opinion or some of those state dynamics that leave many groups underrepresented and without power?
That's a great question. I haven't thought about the federal government like shifting the dynamics at the state level. I mean, I think, it's interesting, like the proposal I make for shifting federalism would aim to do that in part because by insisting that states act in a way that advances equity, that's going to be state legislatures who have to implement those changes. So I do think that's going to drive a conversation. I also actually, frankly, think by the federal government insisting on equity, it gives some state lawmakers cover. Right? Assuming the benevolent state lawmaker who wants to help children in poverty and those in disadvantaged communities, they can just sort of point and say, well, the feds made me do it, right? So let's get this done. So I think that is certainly something that you saw this. I can tell you this also happened with school desegregation. When the Supreme Court finally in 1968, the Green decision said, you have to get to school desegregation now, and you have to have a plan that will work, realistically gets to not Black schools or white schools, but just schools. It gave federal judges cover to say, okay, the Supreme Court said we had to do it, so now we have to do it. Before, the standard was very loose and you could not get there. And so I think the same thing could happen here in that if the federal government insists on equity, state legislatures who are often slow to sort of change who benefits and who doesn't from funding formulas could have some cover to actually do something that help disadvantaged kids. And what's important and why I still think we can get there, and I know Jim had to hop off, but I'll say the other reason I think we can get there is we are the only developed country that gives less money to low-income children's schools. Like if you look at the data, we're an outlier. Other countries realize, oh, you have to invest more in those kids for them to succeed. Everyone, it's just basic school finance 101, except in the United States. And so I do think we can get there because all the other 12 countries have gotten there, right? And so that shift of driving more resources to communities that are most hurt, and it's not just low-income communities, there's a variety of communities that are hurting, like driving support to them is critical for the success of our education system, our democracy. It's critical for having a just nation. Like there's just a whole bunch of things it's critical for. So hopefully that answers your question. I feel like I'm also still answering Jim's question, but hopefully that also answered. Yeah, I think it would drive some of that.
expert Q&A right there, weaving multiple questions and answers together. Thank you. Todd, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, first, thank you, Professor Robinson, for this fascinating talk. I was thinking about the maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity requirements in light of the politics of retrenchment or kind of scaling back spending. And I was wondering, and this may push you into the realm of some speculation, but I was thinking about this in light of the Build Back Better plan for Biden's plan for universal preschool, and how you would think about the potential sustainability of that, given that the funding would be through fiscal year 2028, and then it kind of, the federal government's funding gradually phases out, and then there's just kind of a drop off, and it's like, well, hopefully, states will continue to just fund the program. And so I'm thinking like one story is that this is a new service or new access to early childhood education for many people. And so maybe it'll be very tangible and salient that, oh, people want to keep this now, and then states will keep it. And so I guess I have a two-part question. That was all. Sorry, long prelude. My two-part question is, do you think, based on existing efforts around maintaining the spending after an infusion of funds, do you think that that is a reasonable expectation, or do you have reasons to be highly skeptical of that? And then also within the American Rescue Plan, are there areas that, are there ways in which the benefits of that are likely to self-reinforce and create benefits that people will want to keep, even if the maintenance of equity or maintenance of effort requirements don't get us there? Does that make sense?
I think I didn't understand the second question as much, but let me answer the first one,
okay,
and then maybe you can clarify the second one. So do I think it's is it likely feasible politically that if the federal government does an infusion for pre-K, then the states were going to pick it up after federal funding drops off? That's what I heard the first question to be. Yeah, so I think there's a couple reasons for optimism. First, the data is overwhelming for preschool, that investing in preschool has, just long-term benefits for not just the children and families, but for society. Like money spent at preschool yields, outsized benefits. Like I don't remember the exact number, but it's like for every dollar invested in preschool, you get like this significant return, right? And so because of that, there's a lot of bipartisan support for preschool. It's sort of like who's against little kids in some way, to simplify it. But the basic idea is like, there's a lot of support for preschool, in part because the research is so robust that the investment, the government funds, whether you're fiscally conservative or more fiscally liberal, you will be willing to put the money to preschool, in part because the returns on investment are so robust. And so that's one of the reasons for, that's both reasons. One is that the research is so strong that it's a sound investment, and two, that the political support for that is much broader than for many things, right? Now that's not true in every state, right? You can probably find states that are not on board with preschool, but there's more political agreement about preschool than there is in many issues. So I think there is some room for optimism. I don't think by 2028 you're going to see enough benefits of it for people to like, they're going to have to, in some ways, it's going to be an exercise in trust. You're not going to see the transformation of society by 2028 if we make this big investment now. You're going to have to just trust that in the long term, it's going to have these benefits. I think the other thing that the case that will be made when it's time for states to start putting in more money is that you'll start to see some of the benefits, but you also will have studies that will show the counter. In other words, where this investment was not made, here are the costs that we're seeing. And so basically the pitch that will be made to states is you're going to pay now or you're going to pay later. And you're going to pay less now. You're going to pay less now when you invest in preschool, and you're going to pay later when you have to pay for juvenile justice, criminal justice, healthcare costs for undereducated individuals, social supports such as welfare and food stamps and housing assistance. You're going to pay for all that later, or you can pay for 3 and 4 year olds now. And it's way cheaper to pay for 3 and 4 year olds now. And so I think that because of that argument, I think that you can get to, and the sort of bipartisan nature of preschool, or bipartisan support, it's not really by nature, but there's support on both sides of the aisle. You could get to states sustaining those programs, particularly as families start to rely on them. You can see some really activated and motivated parents coming together in coalitions to support education, pre-K education, just as you're seeing now. I can tell you, there's a real movement happening. You guys might already know this, but there's a real movement happening among parents about just, trying to understand and demand what rights they have for education because of COVID, because they saw schools shut down, because they saw what was happening, what education their kids were getting, because they had to step up and give, provide education. Parents are more activated now in education than they were before COVID. And I think that can be leveraged in a lot of sort of important ways. But clarify your second question. I wasn't totally clear on it.
So your answer helps me clarify, which is, do you think the benefits of the American Recovery Plan in K-12 spending will be sufficient to motivate states to keep up that spending, even if the maintenance of effort requirements weren't there? Do you think that helps, or do you think it's too murky relative to, say, as you described with preschool, there's like more support, more understanding of research that's out there? So yeah, how do you see that playing out with?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I don't, it's almost 4,000 per child. That the federal government invested. To think that states can make that up once that money, is spent. I don't see states being able to make that up. I do think that it should last longer than the, couple of years that they have to maintain maintenance of equity. So I think one of the challenges is it's just a large amount. So I don't think the states by themselves can get to 4,000 per people across the board. That's just a large federal infusion. To see them get to that, I would be really surprised. However, what I'm hoping for, but we'll see what happens, I think it's going to be a very mixed bag, is this whole idea that you mentioned of build back better. The question is, do people just keep replicating what they were doing before, or are we doing new things? And I think, I'm hoping that there's going to be some innovation that comes out of this time of crisis. I think there's a lot of researchers, in fact, I know that there are quite a few researchers who are pushing exactly that tagline of build back better. In other words, let's not just come back and do what we were doing. Let's try to build a better education system. I'm affiliated with the Learning Policy Institute, and they put out early on a very robust report about, hey, we can come back and do better. We don't have to just keep doing the same thing. So I think that is quite possible to happen, that you can build back better, as opposed to merely just redoing what we were doing, which, as I started my talk, was explaining, that wasn't working. Like, we had significant opportunity gaps, and we had significant achievement gaps. So we don't need to replicate something that wasn't working. We can build something better. And I do think COVID provides a chance to do that, even as we work on remediation and tutoring and support for students who are falling behind. I think we can learn to serve those kids better, not just with this federal funding, but with the innovation that comes out of crisis. It's like, when you have to innovate, sometimes you just double down and get it done. And so I do think there's a possibility for that, where there's the political will and the support to innovate and to engage in experimentation. The other thing that's really needed is accountability for where this money is going. There's just a whole bunch of money that went in. And there's, unless states put in really strong accountability systems for how that money is spent, you could end up with some wasteful spending, because there's just a lot of it. And think about it, like, when you're given a lot of money, you're thinking, I might get that $5 latte, right? It's like, you've got to be careful with where every dollar spent is spent. So accountability, at the state and local level will be really critical. And again, accountability is done at the state level, so they've got to figure it out, like they've got to decide. But this research on state accountability mechanisms is not promising. And so, you know, perhaps this amount of money will enable some states to build a good accountability system that would help to track where all this money is going, or else they're going to have, you know, public saying like, where'd the money go? And it's like, you know, we don't want that answer, right? So you got to be sure that you have a robust accountability system that says where the money is going and how it's helping kids and teachers and educators and staff.
Yeah. Thanks for that. We do have
Sure.
one question in the chat from Beth Schuler. I know she has a,
Sure.
a sick little one at home, and so I think she wants to not unmute for right now. But her question is, with these last few minutes, if you're able to dive in about if there's any sort of updates on the Cook versus Raimondo case in terms of any related efforts to use a civics-oriented rationale to visit a federal school finance equity, and does COVID change prospects for a new case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, so Cook versus I think it's Raimondo actually, is a case has asked for the recognition of a federal right to education that was rejected at the district court level. I do believe that it's out of Rhode Island, and I believe that it's on appeal, but I would have to confirm that. Like I would have to double check. I know one of the lawyers who's doing the case, and it was pretty clear that an appeal was going to be filed, but I honestly haven't followed it recently, partly because I was finishing this paper and a paper for the Learning Policy Institute. So I will have to check on that. And that's a great question. But in terms of the, you know, civics-oriented, civics rationale for federal right to education, I do actually think there's an increased amount of activity around that. I think because of the storming of the Capitol. Like, I think there's actually one of the positive things that came out of that is that people realize like, oh, we need a better and deeper understanding of civics, government, peaceful transition of power, all of that amongst our young people, so that we understand that how power is passed on is not by, you know, a storming of the Capitol. It is by through elections and fair and free elections. And so there is I do sense in the education space an increased interest in civics education and in making sure that that is done well and robustly. And even what's really exciting about that is even having children sort of participate in democracy in ways. So for example, modeling democracy in ways in the classroom and things like that. So I think that's really, you know, something that's afoot in terms of what, you know, what's happening with civics education.
Wonderful. Well, we are right at time, so that was a brilliant wrap up. And I know everybody here in the community would like to join in virtually thanking Professor Kimberly Robinson for sharing her time and expertise and knowledge and all of this research. And I know several of our community members are going to be meeting with you here a little bit later this afternoon. So thank you. And I'll be sharing out the recording probably a little bit later today. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this was really wonderful. Thanks for all the great questions. And thanks so much for having me. It was really terrific. So thank you.
Great. Take care.
Lunch.
Great.
You're still recording. Do you want to stop?
Perfect. Yeah, I was like, hold on, let me stop that.